Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel and my next project. This time I wanted to tackle this Su-7 from Modelsvit. But moving straight to the kit, here you can see the kit injection and quality. And I must say, this is definitely not a kit for the faint-hearted. During COVID-19 I had plenty of free time and I got this Su-17 M3R also from Modelsvit. I like this aircraft, even it being ugly and weird. I know, judge me, but I still find it interesting. It was a quite difficult kit to build, but I like it in the end, despite all the headaches in the process. However, it led me to want to build its predecessor both in real life and injection history, the Su-7. I was quite excited when it got to my doormat, but man, when I'd open it, some shivers rolled down my spine. Well, there are definitely worse things out there, but the abysmal difference between the Su-17 and Su-7 kits really got me unprepared. The injection is not quite crispy, the plastic is very brittle, and the lack of detail is a bit disappointing after building the Su-17. I know, this Su-7 kit is much older than the Su-17, but I was caught off guard anyway. There are no guiding pins, panel lines are quite shallow, no rivets of any kind, clear part is not that clear, and the decals, well, I'm not sure about them. On the other hand, the kit seems to be quite accurate, but I didn't compare it to blueprints yet. But at a first look and checking real photos, it looks like promising, despite some contestable panel lines. After looking more closely, I saw that some aftermarket stuff was mandatory. I got a lot of them: resin exhausts, wheels, air scoops and rocket launchers, PE for interior and exterior, metal pitot tube and guns, masks, because I'm lazy, and a decal sheet, because the version I wanted to build does not come in the provided one. Looking at it, I know it will demand a lot of elbow grease, patience and time, but I hope in the end it's worth all the effort. But enough of cheap talk, and let's begin. First, let's tackle the interior. The seat, despite having 4 parts, lacks many details, such as seat belts, cables and other features and shapes. The PE set provides some of these details that I started to add to the kit plastic seat. However, after some painful gluing process, the overall look didn't actually please me. Well, the PE seat belts seem super stiff, and bending them to give a more natural look was out of question, because after some attempts, it just served to show me that I don't have the skills and patience for it. So I decided to rip them off and make new ones from solder and lead wires. But firstly, I added some Tamiya epoxy putty to simulate the cushion on the seat. Also, I sanded the headrest to be more concave and similar to the real KS4 ejection seat. This will not be very visible later on, but it was an easy step that gives a nice touch. Back to the seat belts. I used mainly 0.5mm solder wire that I flattened with my hobby knife handle. One quick tip here: when flattening solder or lead wires, you can imprint some textures in the process if you want. Here I used the handle grip to make an example, but this texture is too rough for 7-second scale. But for fabric texture, I use a super fine metal mesh that doesn't appear a lot, but kills that shiny finish of the flattened metal. Okay, back to the work. After flattening the wires, I cut the sides to make the stripes straight. I cut roughly 1mm wide. The buckles were made bending 0.3mm copper wires with tweezers. I used some features from the PE parts that would be impossible for me to scratch. I just glued these parts separately. Other buckles were also made directly on the flattened solder wire. First I cut a pointy shape in one end, punched a hole in the middle, then pressed only this end with my tweezer handle. In the end, you have a quite convincing buckle for this scale. All these parts were glued in place with black super glue. It seems awful at first, but later I used a deboner to clean everything. Other PE parts were glued on the sides of the seat, and some cables were added here and there. The seat belts are a bit rough for this scale, but I think they look much more natural than the PE ones. Now moving to the cockpit and front wheel bay, that share the same kit parts. Those are also a bit flat if you compare to the real thing. As an early Soviet jet-era aircraft, there are tons of cable passing through the wheelbase. So I drilled some holes and stick some lead wires, making those visible cable mass. The bulkhead behind the ejection seat was completely plain. So I glued some plastic card stripes and drilled some holes to stick more lead wires. These green circles are the wire's insulation chopped to small discs. For the control panel I used the PE parts. To help with alignment, the PE parts were glued with clear varnish, which provides more time for minor adjustments, and you don't need to be concerned with glue stains. Of course, some care while handling should be taken, because the bond is not so strong as using dedicated glue, but it's enough as this part is not to be moving or near places where you used to handle it. Now, arguably one of the downfalls of this kit, the landing gear legs. Here I focus on the front landing gear, but similar problems can be found on the main gears too. First, and more preeminent, is that the front wheel is injected together with the strut. For me, this thing is acceptable only for tail wheels in World War II aircraft, but not for bigger planes. Second, they lack crisp details, and third is that the landing gear is quite flimsy to stand this big and heavy kit. Even more because you have to add some weight in the nose, so it won't sit on its tail. So I cut the wheel to substitute by the resin one, and that sparked a lot of further modifications that will probably potentialize the flimsy problem. I started to dig some holes and substitute the plastic piston by metal one, cut from 1mm thick brass rod. Hydraulic lines were also added using a range of lead wires fixed with CA glue. I decided to follow the manual at this step that instructed to fix the front landing gear before joining the fuselage halves. The same was indicated in the Su-7 that I ignored for painting purpose, and later proved to be a hell on my bench, almost breaking everything and messing with the paint job. Of course it might be a pain to handle the kit during assembling with already fixed landing gear in a constant snap-it situation, but let's try. Well, after thinking I've surpassed this step, it was time for some painting. First I applied a coat of black primer, followed by a mix of Tamiya XF25 and XF23. All details, including the ejection seat, control stick and sidewall controls, were painted with Vallejo acrylics. There were more photo-etched controls to add that I fixed using black superglue. Those are quite plain, but much better than the provided decals. The final step was to apply a dark bluish-gray pin wash that I mixed using oils, followed by highlighting some minor details with light gray dry brush. As I said before, I purchased a resin exhaust from Reskit, which is light years better than the kit's one. Of course, it will be almost not visible in the end, but that's a kit modder's life, I guess. So I painted it with XF71 and lighter shades, then used a dark green wash. For the nozzle, I painted it first with different Vallejo colors, increasing contrast as much as possible. Then I airbrushed multiple thin layers of Alclad jet exhaust. In the end, most of the color variation is hidden, but depending on the light incidence, you can notice different hues. Now back to that disturbing front landing gear. Of course I broke the wheel fork several times, and each time I fixed it, it was just a matter of time to break it again. So I was really upset, to not say worse, and decided to cut them off and replace it by new forks made from 0.5mm plastic sheet. Definitely not beautiful, but at least the plastic is more flexible and stronger. At least I hope so. Then I glued the cockpit halves and sanded the seam lines on the intake cone. With a metal file I refined the wheel fork shape and then drilled some holes in it, stick a brass rod to help with alignment, and prepare it to fit the resin front wheel. You think these modifications were enough? Of course not, I had to make things more difficult. So I decided to open the auxiliary intake inlets. I carved the plastic with drills and knives and cut some copper rectangles to make the inlets, which proved to be an ill decision for two reasons. but more on that later. Gluing the fuselage halves was a slow and laborious job. Gluing it part by part to try to align with tons of panel lines without any guiding pins to help? Wow, that was a pain. But with a lot of patience, I guess I made it good enough. Of course, some nasty joints were visible in awful places, like here in the exhaust. Later, I filled them and sanded a few times until they vanished. Then it was my most loving part, rescribing, yay! But no. And I mean a lot, basically the whole aircraft length. So sanding, rescribing and checking over and over was almost an endless cycle. I used a razor saw and some tapes to help making the straight lines, but that was super difficult, because any slip means restarting the whole process. The wings also had to be modified to properly fit the upper and lower halves. A lot of scraping and sanding had to be done to get rid of the small step close to the ailerons on the lower side. The same happened on the vertical stabilizer. And here comes the razor saw again, this time to cut the plastic between the ailerons, right on the panel line, to increase the idea of movable surface. The intake outer ring was really thick and had to be thinned, otherwise it would appear quite weird by just gluing it as it comes. Before gluing the intake ring, I already drilled the hole for the brass antenna, trying to leave it in a tight fit and align with the airframe. I added some rivets, not all of them, but the ones along with panel lines and other inspection ports, mainly the most prominent ones. Using the tape as a guide was much easier to make straight lines. The main wheel wells are also very basic. If you look photos from the real machine, you'll see tons of rivets and cables everywhere. To enhance this kit part, I punched some rivets around the structure and added lead wires of different gauges to simulate the hydraulic cables. The wing fences from the kit are so-so, the PE ones are much better. However, I had to sink a bit the guiding lines on the wings so the PE would better fit. I also cut the position lights on the wingtips with my good and old razor saw, taking out the plastic, then drilling and inserting a little piece of copper wire, painted its tip to simulate a light bulb, and later added UV resin. There are not many hardpoints or loadout options for this kit, so I took advantage of this opportunity to try to use magnets to hold weapons and fuel tanks in place, which will make things light years easier on later stages, to hold weapons in place without ruining the paint job. I just drilled holes in the racks and weapons and glued some 1x1mm cylindrical magnets. Very easy, but be careful to don't mess up with the magnet poles, otherwise you will end up with the opposite effect. Okay, here's the first misjudgment on the auxiliary intake inlets. The copper sheet is very thin and look nice, but just a small cross eye and it falls apart. Not quite resistant. So I substitute them again with thin plastic sheet. I thought it was a big move, but more on that later. Gluing the tail section and wings were a nightmare, because for the tail there is no guiding line whatsoever. The wings have some, but they are super shallow and maintaining the plane's dihedral is a really tough mission. Besides, big gaps are visible. I tried many different things to fill them, but the wing roots are quite difficult and tricky parts to sand. In the end, I had to use a plastic strip to hide them, which was a good solution because there is a tiny joint reinforcement on the rear plane. The canopy comes in a single piece, and of course I want to make it open, so some of the work I put on the cockpit could be visible in the end. With a razor saw, I split the canopy and the windshield apart. Later, I sanded and polished it a lot, and I mean a lot. Last step was a dump in Alclad Ecogloss varnish, and I have to say that it paid the effort. Then I masked the in and outside of the canopy and the windshield, airbrushed the inside color, removed the inner masks, and glued the windshield in place. And of course a nasty gap was noticeable, but at this stage I was already expecting it. I filled it with plastic card stripe, then I sanded it so the transition between windshield and fuselage would be as smooth as possible. Glued the antenna and pitot tubes in place, which might turn into a hell during painting, and painted the landing light with Mr. Hobby Silver, added a 1mm bearing ball for the bulb, and covered it with UV resin. I gave a coat of primer to check for flaw joints and so on. There were tons of them, but that was okay, despite the whole process being quite boring. Anyway, have you noticed the second problem with the auxiliary intake inlets? Well, not sure if that was a cardinal error, but checking a lot of photos, I would say that 98% of them the inlets appear open to the inside, not outside as I firstly made. I found 1 or 2 photos of parked Su-17 with the inlets open outside, but I guess it's not very usual. So to lay in bed peacefully every night, I made the surgical procedure under gallons of sweat and fear, and made an opened inside. Of course there are some terrifying parts ahead, aka the main landing gears, but I decided that the way the kit is enough for starting the painting process. So thanks for checking this building, I hope you like it and found something useful for you. See you in the next time.